Welcome to Story Chat Radio. We are book editors Carly Hayward and Jenny Chappelle. Every month we watch a different movie with an eye for storytelling and novel writing.
We use our years of training and experience editing novels to break down each movie's storytelling elements to help you improve your novel in progress.
Warning, Jenny ruins everything.
Hey, you ruin things too.
So don't be surprised if there are spoilers. On this episode, we are discussing the animated film Encanto, and then we'll end with a critique of one lucky author's query. And just as a reminder, you can now support the podcast on Patreon, where you can read the queries we critique, plus get lots of other bonus content. It's easy to find. Just go to patreon.com/storychatradio.
Here come the spoilers. We start the movie with a short prologue where a young Alma Madrigal loses her husband Pedro, but saves their infant triplets. The candle she carries with her becomes magical and creates a sentient house, the casita, which protects the village that grows up around it and gifts the Madrigal family magical abilities, all except Mirabelle, who has no gift. The Madrigals in the casita all live in the casita, except for Bruno, but we don't really get a clear explanation about why he left. In the beginning anyway. We do get that later. On the day the youngest cousin is gifted, this is sort of like where the story actually starts, is gifted with the ability to speak to animals. Mirabelle has what seems like a vision of the casita cracking, but her warnings are ignored by the rest of the family when everything seems fine. Mirabelle resolves to save the magic and the casita, and so she decides to investigate. Her older sister Luisa tells her that her gift of strength is weakening and suggests that Bruno's room may hold clues. And of course, no one's supposed to go in there because we don't talk about Bruno.
We don't.
There, Mirabelle finds pieces of a slab that seem to show her causing the casita to fall apart. When she leaves, they have a dinner where her older sister Isabella is to become engaged, and the casita begins to crack again during this dinner. During that, while all of the commotion is going on, Mirabelle catches a glimpse of a man she chases through a hidden passage in the walls, which was giving me like feelings of White Smoke, if anyone has read that book, and freaking me out a little bit, but it was fine. He turns out to be Bruno, who never really left their house at all because he still loves his family. Bruno summons another vision, which shows the casita collapsing and Mirabelle embracing Isabella, who blamed Mirabelle for the failed proposal. The sisters reconcile, but Abuela blames Mirabelle for everything that's happening to them. Mirabelle snaps, finally, and blames Abuela for making everyone do things her way. Their argument creates a gigantic fissure that destroys the casita and extinguishes the magical candle, effectively stripping the Madrigals of their powers. Abuela admits to forgetting the real gift was not the powers, but the family itself. They reconcile, and with Bruno in tow, reunite the Madrigals to rebuild the casita, assisted by the villagers. When Mirabelle places the last doorknob, the casita springs back to life and the magic returns. The movie ends with the Madrigals taking their first family picture with Mirabelle and Bruno now included in it. Carly, what did you think of the movie?
Okay. So I do really like this movie, but I don't love it. And I know everyone's going to get really mad at me and hate me for this.
I'm already really mad at you.
I know. I can feel it through the computer. The hatred is strong from you. It's fine.
She's refusing to make eye contact with me right now.
It's true. I am. I'm looking everywhere but at my computer. I do really like it. I felt like some things were missing for me. I like the music, especially the more that I listen to it. I love Mirabelle and Luisa, and I love the whole second generation trauma that's explored in this. I think that's really, really interesting and done very well. But I had two problems. One was I felt like it leaned really heavily into like the Broadway musical territory where almost too much happens in a song. Like, we don't need to meet the entire family or town in one song. I kind of wanted to like get to know the characters a little bit. Um, which I think kind of leads me into my main problem, which is I felt like I wanted to care about their relationships more than I did. Like the movie sets up all of these really interesting relationships, and especially between Mirabelle and Isabella, and the big moment is their reconciliation, or one of the big moments is their reconciliation, and I don't really care because I haven't spent time with Isabella or their relationship very much. And in the beginning, Mirabelle's huge relationship is with her younger cousin, and he kind of just disappears from the rest of the story. So I just kind of felt like I wanted to go deeper into those relationships, and we didn't have the time because so much was happening. Basically, I kind of feel like Lin-Manuel Miranda was given so much power in this, and no one really reined in his genius a little bit. That was kind of where I was missing stuff. But that all being said, I really did like it. I related to Louisa probably way too much, and Mirabelle a little bit too. And the music is very catchy. Like, I wake up in the middle of the night with the song stuck in my head. And it's not just because my friend's baby makes me watch it like a million times, but it is very good. I have some things that I would love it if like certain things were a little bit better, I guess. All right, so bring on your hatred. What did you think?
Yeah, like I'm stunned.
Yeah.
Like
it's fair.
I'm going to need some time to process this information about you, Carly.
I get it. Is the podcast done? Like, are we dissolving?
It might be.
This
might be our last episode. It might be.
Wow.
It's possible.
Wow.
I might have to just, like, stop acknowledging your existence.
Okay.
So I get what you're saying about it, but you're wrong.
I see.
Here's why. Here's why. It's honestly one of my favorite Disney movies now. And I think part of it is it focuses on family over romance, and that it has no real villain. I think the representation of mental health issues and how people mask them feels so real and heartbreaking.
I agree with all of that.
And so here's the part where you're wrong.
Okay.
Yeah. Here's the part where you're wrong. I like that we don't get into the individual relationships as much, because I think this story is really about how big families function as a unit and how individuals feel lost in all of that, especially when they feel like an outsider or like they don't belong for some reason. So that's why you're wrong, and why I won't completely just like stop talking to you.
Oh, okay. I'm just not going to argue.
That's not what this is about.
Choosing to not argue on this. Continue.
Okay, so, this is totally the adult in me, but Abuela was such a heartbreaking character. Like, her strength and what she did alone at what was likely a very young age. Like, I've seen speculation about when exactly this takes place, and we're talking probably around the turn of the last century. Chances are, as, you know, being a not super wealthy family, she was probably pretty young. She had 3 infants, which, like, is it me, or did it seem like she, like, popped those babies out and they just left, like, right away? So, like, all of that, anyway. So the strength that really served her well at that point in her life is what is causing problems for her in the, like, more modern day, the current story that we're seeing. And I think that's really, it's so real in my experience of, like, the things that serve you well at one point don't always serve you well, and I really liked all of that. So I think this movie is really ambitious. I can totally see how it might feel like it's too much because of that. I did really love it. And truly, I do agree that we don't really get to know the secondary characters enough, and would love to see an animated series come from this show, so that people who did like the movie can, like, really get to see more of those interactions. And of course, like, I'm a huge fan of the Tangled series. I think that was really possibly, like, the best kind of offshoot they've had of one of their movies. So yeah, I think that would be fabulous. Are you listening, Disney? I want to see an animated series. So
it is the only thing that will fix our relationship. So
we need
please,
it.
thank you. Need it.
All right. So moving on, so that we don't have to argue right now. What's something this movie does well that writers can use in their own work?
Emotional wounds. Oh, wait. No.
Perfect.
We did that last month. Oops. Okay. So instead, I think it is a character arc. So all of these characters really, really grow and change so much over the course of the movie. And not just Mirabelle, which is very important. They all have these deep emotional wounds, but they use these wounds, or because of these wounds, they are able to change and grow. Character arc and emotional wounds are really very intrinsically tied, and that makes sense that both would be really strong in this movie.
Yeah.
And yet they're different enough that we can do this as another topic. So people definitely shouldn't feel that we cheated on topics in any way. Definitely not. We did not. Anyway, so Mirabelle has very clear character arcs, but so does Luisa, Isabella, Abuela, even Bruno, who we will not talk about and do not talk about. He also has character arcs. So oftentimes it's easy to only have the protagonist change over the course of your story, but better stories give character arcs to multiple characters, just like this one does. So we get to see that everyone is as complex and interesting as Mirabelle is. They're not just foils for her to play off of. They're real people with their own unique stories. And more in modern fiction, we're kind of seeing that casts of characters are getting more attention and depth and growth. So not just like multi-POV stories like Six of Crows, but side characters in a romance novel, even though they usually get their own books, or like the best friend to the main character are more and more getting their own arcs themselves. And I think this movie does that very well.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, and like you said, in most modern fiction, the main character goes through some kind of internal change over the course of the story. So like Carly mentioned, we did just do a whole episode about emotional wounds, so I'm not going to go over that too much, but I do want to talk a little bit about how emotional wounds work with the character arc specifically. So as a quick reminder, the emotional wound is a negative event or pattern of events that causes deep emotional pain for the character and affects how they see their world and their place in it. And ideally, that emotional wound should be the foundation for your main character's motivation. Now, this is not necessarily something they're aware of, just like in real life, we aren't always aware of our own deep inner pain. So it can color their actions and perspective without them even really knowing what's happening. For example, Abuela, again, might be my favorite character in the movie. She wants a good life for her family, but her emotional wound, having to leave her home, her husband dying, raising 3 babies on her own, really without any real life experience, creates this internal problem for her of a deep fear that anything good can be taken from her kind of at any moment.
Yeah, I think that's a really great example. All right, so we've touched on character arcs before when we talked about satisfying endings, because they tie into that as well. But basically, as Jenny kind of has explained before, character arc is all about the internal changes your character goes through as the plot acts on them. So characters can change positively, negatively, or flatly by the end of your story. But the important thing is that they transform internally. So they don't need to become entirely different people, but they need to grow and learn. They need to solidify their beliefs or gain new ones or change morally or have a very tragic fall. So we break that down into 3 pieces to create a very solid character arc. Number 1 is the goal. So you start with your character's goal. What do they want in life? What do they want at the beginning of this story? Next, you have the lie. So when you find the lie, it's what lie is the character telling themselves that stops them from achieving their goal? Or is their goal itself destructive and the lie they tell themselves is that the goal will be good? And then there's the truth. The truth is the truth reveals the lie to your character. There we go. By the end, they will have learned that the lie wasn't in their way, that they could overcome it, or they will learn that their goal was destructive. So Jenny and I have started to kind of mention the different types of arcs your character can have. And there's basically 3 main arcs. They have a million different names, but there's positive, neutral, and negative. With a positive arc, your character is going to overcome the lie to become a better person. And here, being a better person can mean being more comfortable with themselves, stronger in their beliefs, morally on the right path, etc. With a neutral arc, the character usually has internally grown or learned something, but they're more of a reflection on the world changing around them. And then finally, the negative arc is where we get all of those kind of Shakespearean tragedies, where the character's fatal flaw leads them to a descent that they can't or don't come back from.
Right.
So basically, no matter the outcome, your character needs to grow and learn and change in some way. So we see this I'm going to go with Mirabelle, Louisa, and Isabella. So let's start with Louisa and Isabella. Both of them realize that the lie that they're telling themselves isn't true. They learn to overcome the limits and constraints that they've put on themselves. So Louisa learns that she doesn't need to carry the weight of everyone on their shoulders. She can let them support themselves or fail themselves. Isabella learns that she isn't restricted to being perfect or symmetrical or whatever people expect her to be. She can have thorns and edginess. She can be whoever she wants to be. Now, Mirabelle has kind of a complicated arc, and I was kind of discussing this with Jenny earlier. I could argue it being both neutral and positive. Mirabelle learns that she doesn't have to prove herself to everyone. She learns that not everyone is as perfect as she's thought. But at the same time, her arc is kind of about teaching others that their magical powers aren't their only worth. She shows them that she has worth too. She kind of pushes the world to change around her and grow, while she herself stays mostly the same. She doesn't have to try as hard. But mainly I feel like she also teaches the world to accept her as she is, and that she is inherently worthy. So I could see it going either way. Like, she does learn to love herself as herself, but also mostly she teaches everyone else that, no, she's great as she is, if that makes sense.
What I'm hearing is I'm going to have to fight you about this too.
I think it's both. Why
We're
are you
just gonna
fighting
fight
me?
over this movie? Because we're moving on.
Oh my God. Okay. Wow. I think I'm agreeing with you, and yet here we are. Moving on.
I think she has an internal shift from trying to prove herself by doing what other people want her to do.
Yeah, that's what I said.
Let me just finish.
Okay.
So she starts at the beginning where she's trying very hard to prove herself by doing what she thinks other people want her to do. Mm-hmm. By like trying to force her way into being part of the family because she feels excluded. And her shift over the course of the movie is feeling like she can't force her way in, that she has to do what's right, even if other people disagree with her. Mm-hmm. And that's how she brings others in. She is more of herself through the course of the story. She kind of takes off the mask that she's wearing for others, and in doing so empowers other people to do that. She doesn't intentionally create a shift in other people. That's not her goal.
I don't think that's what I was saying.
Recognize the masks that they are wearing because of her.
Right.
I don't think that action really has anything to do with her. So I don't think her own change really reflects anything about the world outside of her. I think the change outside of her reflects her inner change.
Right, but that's kind of what I'm saying a neutral arc is that the outside is reflecting her internal arc. No? I feel like we're saying the same thing, but you seem very angry at me, so...
Well, I'm still harboring a lot of resentment about, our earlier little,
I get it. I get it.
misunderstanding.
I do think I am saying the same thing you're saying. I agree. But I also think the world,
Anyway.
her arc pushes the world to change. And in that way, she becomes more of herself and kind of is at the same place she was at in the beginning, more so. And in that way, it's kind of a neutral arc, but not in a bad way. This isn't a bad thing.
I just disagree.
I see.
She is not in the same place she was at the beginning.
Okay, moving on.
Okay, so speaking of the beginning, in the beginning of your story, your character is going to have like an internal problem caused by their emotional wound, and it keeps them from really being able to have what they want and need in their lives. A huge part of showing the character's ordinary world in the very beginning, you're supposed to do like their normal everyday world, is establishing a baseline for the change that will come later. And we often see that as being like the external change of, this is what their world was like at the beginning, and then this is what their world is like at the end. Mm-hmm. But that internal change is really important as well. So we need to see for each major turning point in the story, the character will have to evaluate their involvement in the events of the plot. And that often comes down to this understanding of what they want versus what they need. Mm-hmm. So essentially what's happening is your character is going further into exploring the difference between what they think they need and want and what they actually really need. So from my example earlier, Abuela wants to protect herself against ever feeling that level of loss again, which who wouldn't?
Mm-hmm.
If you've ever experienced grief, it's a very natural feeling to be like, I never want to go through that again. But what she needs is to realize that the terrible things that happened in her past weren't her fault, and that she can't control whether anything bad happens again. Like, to think about another Disney movie. I think as a parent, I often think about in Finding Nemo, where the dad is like, I don't want anything to happen to him. And then Dory is like, well, but then nothing would ever happen to him. Right. So she's just become very overprotective and controlling because of this fear that she has. The best way to show that character's arc in terms of setting it up and showing the change throughout is through your character's reactions. So regardless of whether you're writing in close or distant point of view, the reader still needs to see what is going on in your character's thoughts and emotions and how those internal reactions tie into the character's external reactions or actions, So basically, we need to understand the meaning of each action they take, no matter how large or small that action is. We need to be able to draw a connection between what they do and this picture they have of themselves and how that they fit into their world. So Abuela sees herself, and honestly, everybody else sees her like that too, as really holding everything together. And as she isn't able to do that anymore, we get these little glimpses of the crack in her facade, like when Mirabelle hears her praying at the window. So even though we don't necessarily know every little thing Abuela thinks and feels, we get enough information to see that later, when she gets angry and yells at Mirabelle, this is her fear is what's behind that. So it's not like it just comes out of nowhere that she just starts yelling. We understand what's driving it. So over the course of the story, she eventually realizes that her, like I mentioned earlier, her coping skills that served her in those early years are no longer serving her and her family. Her personality won't fundamentally change when Disney does do the series of the Madrigal family. But this one element shifts. So, yeah, connections.
I completely agree.
Good.
So next, we are going to get into character arc and theme. They're both intrinsically tied together. So you want to use your main character arc to reflect the theme of your story and vice versa. The emotional journey that your character goes on is the part of the story that your readers will connect with the most, because emotions are what connect us as humans, and therefore it's what will connect your reader to your character. So because of that, you want your theme to be a reflection of the character arc. So, despite our anger in this episode, I'm going to take a minute here and actually directly quote Jenny from our episode on theme, because honestly, it's my favorite definition, and I'm really
pacify me by quoting me.
No, I'm regretting this already, but here we are. So, Good job. Anyway, theme, here's her quote. Theme is a deeper layer of meaning that underlies the expressed elements of the story, like plot, character, dialogue, etc., and speaks to an aspect of the human condition that is larger than any one character or story. So, because...
Wow, I said that?
I know, isn't it so good?
It is. Like, that makes me sound really smart.
You are smart. But yes, it does make you sound smart. That's true. All right, so because theme is a reflection of the human condition, it will inherently be tied to your character arc. So in a way, your character arc is the most direct expression of your theme. It is the part of your story that deals with your characters in the most human way. So as you're working on layering in your theme, look to your character arc and make sure that they align. Or even use your character arc to help you figure out what your theme is. So in this movie, the theme is about finding your worth and being yourself. And especially as a second generation immigrant. So all three of the main grandchildren have character arcs that reflect this theme. That's all, Jenny. Are you still flabbergasted?
I agree.
Oh my goodness. Agree. Wow. Okay. Whew. We're bringing our friendship back.
Okay. Okay, so if you're a writer, how do you know if a character arc is working and how can you fix it if it isn't? Typically, this is something that you would get from feedback. I think character arc is sometimes one of those things that's really hard to see on your own and know whether it's working or not because you've got all that information in your own head. Mm-hmm. So you might hear that the character feels too flat, that the reader didn't connect with them or understand their motivations, that they aren't as interesting or engaging as the other characters. Agency problems can also be connected to character arc. So like if the reader doesn't understand the meaning behind a character's actions, it can be hard to tell if the events of the plot are connected to that character. If we don't understand their goals, it can be hard to know if their actions are intentional or if they're just sort of going along with the flow. Sometimes it can also come through as voice issues because not enough of the character's personality, motivations, and reactions are coming through to give a strong sense of who the character is and what's really important to them. And I've actually seen that where someone has gotten feedback that their voice needs work, but it's actually these other issues and the voice is fine. And of course, you might just get the feedback that your character needs to have a stronger or a more satisfying arc. So if you're getting any feedback along these lines, I recommend going back to the character arc and emotional wound. In the beginning, are you setting up that baseline? Are you showing how the character reacts to smaller everyday conflicts in their ordinary world? Do we see how their emotional wound creates that deeper meaning behind their actions and decisions and how it's creating problems in their life before the main action of the plot even gets started? We need to see hints of this starting on literally the first page. Very subtle, just planting little seeds. Then at each of the major turning points where the plot takes a turn, how does that impact your character? Go deeper than the surface level. Don't only consider sort of the life and death stakes. Think about how they think of themselves and their place in the world. So to use my abuela example, she thinks of herself as holding their life together. So how is that challenged when Mirabelle starts investigating? What fears would that bring up for abuela? At first, she reacts by doing what she's always done, like trying to take charge. But when that doesn't work, she doubles down. Whereas Mirabelle makes the choice to question what's happening. This is the heart of the conflict between them. And that's why it's personal, that's why we get these highly personal stakes. If one of them had made a different choice, the story might have gone in a very different way. Once you're clear on how those turning points affect your character on that deeper level, use that as a guide for their reactions in that portion of the story. So if you kind of think of your story as being broken into little sections in between the main plot points, then you're going to show the change in their reactions between, from one plot point to the next. And then make sure you're actually showing those reactions instead of just expecting readers to infer them. What readers will infer is the connection and the meaning. That part you don't have to spell out. But if you don't show how things affect your character, your reader can't infer those reactions through the course of a whole book.
Yeah, agreed. All right, so now let's take this a little bit further away from your main character. So once you nail your main character's arc, you're going to want to work on your secondary characters. So now, while this might not be necessary, I highly, highly, highly encourage you to do this. It's grown a ton in modern writing, and it is the best way to make your world feel real and three-dimensional. Your story may have a main character, but they aren't the only real person in this world. Everyone else shouldn't only be there to serve your main character's story. I mean, that is kind of arguable, but in modern times, you want to steer away from that. So you want your important secondary characters to grow as well, even if it is in a much smaller way. So Luisa's arc doesn't take a ton of screen time, but she changes and grows. The secondary character arcs don't need to take up a ton of space, but they will flesh out your world in a really strong way. And they'll also probably be tied in with your subplots or with your main character's growth themselves. So now is where it can get kind of really fun to play with these character arcs. So your secondary characters can have arcs that span the full series, as should your main character, but it can be really fun to do this with the secondary characters. So maybe they haven't really grown much over the course of the first book, but maybe they will as the series progresses. As the hero goes on their journey, you want to kind of think about the important people around them and how they're going to grow too, especially in reaction to your main character. Or even better, the next book in the series can be a secondary character story. And this is very easily best seen in a romance series where secondary characters are like the best friend in a book is the person that gets the romance in the second book, and so on. Like, look at the Bridgerton series where each book focuses on a different Bridgerton sibling. So really play with your secondary character arcs, because they can be really fun and a great way to kind of flesh out your whole world.
Yeah.
All right. Are we still friends, Jenny?
I'm still thinking about it.
Okay. Well,
we're still friends, I guess.
Whatever. It's fine. We really
don't come at me about my Disney movies.
Okay. It's okay. Okay.
Truce.
All right. So this month, let's talk about our query, because I think we need to move on from this movie. This month, our query is an adult fantasy. Jenny, what are your thoughts on the query?
Overall, I think this is a really good query in that it lays out the stakes. It focuses on the main character and the main conflict. But it feels like there's some information here we don't really need in the query. So, for example, I think you could just tell us that your main character fakes a relationship with his friend without kind of a whole paragraph explaining the reasoning and how it comes to be. In general, I advise authors to consider what is the central conflict that you need to explain in your query, what information ties directly to that, what can your reader infer without you explaining, just based on information they already have from like the cultural consciousness kind of thing. And so in this case, I think that the only information we really need to know, one of the 4 political intrigue type things that you tell us in the 3rd paragraph, and you can completely cut the 4th and 5th paragraphs. So yeah, just really pare down to the bare essentials that will get the reader to understand and connect with the stakes, the main conflict, and why the main character has to be involved. What did you think, Carly?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's a really solid query that sounds very interesting to me. I love that it's this humanistic look in an adult fantasy. But like you said, it's getting overly detailed in some areas. We're learning about the internal conflict for a couple paragraphs before we even get to the main external conflict. So, while the internal conflict definitely needs to be there and is wonderful, it can be cut down quite a bit. I think either the third or fourth paragraph could be cut basically entirely. It'll move the query along much quicker. Because they kind of give us identical information, give or take a sentence. So anyway, I could get really granular here on what could be cut, and I'm going to try not to because that's not fun for a podcast.
Sure.
But it's there's a lot of really good query stuff here. It's all kind of there. We just need to really tighten it up and get rid of all that extraneous detail.
Yeah, agreed.
All right. So, as a heads up, we do not have a podcast in April because both Jenny and I will be up to our eyeballs in RevPit submissions. If you haven't heard about RevPit, feel free to look it up. It's a great Twitter contest. But we're going to make up for it in May when we have a super special episode with a double feature. That's right. Woo! We're going to be watching both Star Wars A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back.
And probably fighting over it.
Why are we going to fight?
We just probably will. I have some very strong feelings about Star Wars.
Oh, no. Was this
and
all
not
a
the ones
mistake?
that people might expect.
Oh, no. I regret everything. Oh, boy. Okay, well, tune in for that, I guess. I hope you like us arguing. All right. We'll also have another query or blurb critique. If you want your query featured on the podcast, you can find the details about how to do that on our website or Twitter page.
You can find our podcast on our website, storychatradio.com, or you can follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or many other streaming services. While you're there, please leave us a rating. You can see this month's query in its entirety and support the show at patreon.com/storychatradio. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at storychatradio.
Thanks for joining in our nonsense.